David had always been the quiet type, the kind of guy who preferred books over parties, coffee over beer, and silence over small talk. His small apartment on the third floor of an old brick building had become his perfect hideaway from the world. 3 months ago, when his roommate Jake moved out after getting his degree early, David thought he'd finally found his slice of peace. The apartment wasn't much to look at. A tiny kitchen that barely fit one person, a living room that doubled as his study space, and a bedroom just big enough for a bed and a desk. But it was his, and that's all that mattered. The walls were covered with psychology textbooks, research papers, and sticky notes with important quotes about human behavior. This was his world, and he loved every quiet minute of it. David was working on his graduate thesis about why people connect with each other. It was ironic, really. Here he was, studying human relationships while barely having any himself. He spent most of his time reading about how people form bonds, how they trust each other, and what makes them feel close. Yet in his real life, he could count his close friends on one hand. Every evening followed the same routine. He'd come home from the university library, make himself a simple dinner, and spread his research across the coffee table. The apartment would fill with the soft glow of his desk lamp as he worked late into the night. He found comfort in this predictable rhythm. No surprises, no drama, just him and his studies. The building was usually quiet, especially on weekday evenings. Most of the other students had different schedules or went out more than he did. David liked it that way. The less noise, the better he could focus. He had developed this habit of leaving his front door unlocked during his study sessions. It was something he'd done since childhood in his small hometown, where everyone knew everyone and trust came naturally. His neighbors were friendly enough, but they kept to themselves mostly. There was Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived downstairs and always smiled when she saw him. She sometimes needed help carrying groceries, and David was always happy to lend a hand. There was also the young woman who lived across the hall. He'd seen her around for months but had never really talked to her beyond polite hellos in the hallway. She was different from him in every way he could imagine. Where he was careful and planned, she seemed free and spontaneous. He'd often hear music coming from her apartment, not loud enough to bother anyone, but lively enough to remind him that some people lived their lives with more color than he did. Sometimes he'd catch glimpses of her coming home with art supplies or heading out dressed in clothes that looked like they told a story. He didn't even know her name, really. They'd exchange brief pleasantries when they bumped into each other, at the mailboxes or in the stairwell, but that was about it. She had this way of looking at people, though, like she was really seeing them. It made David a little nervous, to be honest. He wasn't used to being noticed. On this particular Thursday evening, David was deeper into his research than usual. He discovered a fascinating study about spontaneous human connections and how they could change the entire course of someone's life. The researcher had interviewed hundreds of people about moments when they took unexpected risks in relationships. The stories were compelling, full of people who stepped outside their comfort zones and found something beautiful on the other side. As he read, David couldn't help but think about his own life. When was the last time he'd taken any kind of risk? When had he ever done something spontaneous or unexpected? The answer was probably never. He lived his life like he wrote his research papers, carefully planned, thoroughly researched, and with no room for surprises. The apartment was perfectly quiet except for the gentle hum of his refrigerator and the occasional sound of a car passing by on the street below. His textbooks were arranged neatly around him, highlighters and pens organized by color. This was his element, his safe space where everything made sense and followed logical patterns. He had no idea that everything was about to change, that in just a few minutes his carefully ordered world would be turned completely upside down by someone who lived life very differently than he did, someone who believed in taking chances, in following her instincts, and in the power of one bold moment to change everything. The research paper in his hands talked about how the most meaningful connections often happen when we least expect them, how sometimes the universe puts people in our path at exactly the right moment, even when we think we're not ready for it. David found these ideas interesting from an academic standpoint, but he never imagined he was about to become a real-life example of everything he was studying. The clock on his wall ticked steadily toward midnight, and David was completely absorbed in his work, having no idea that his quiet, predictable evening was about to become the most unforgettable night of his life. The sound of his door opening made David's heart skip a beat. He looked up from his research papers, expecting to see his landlord, or maybe someone who had the wrong apartment. But it wasn't either of those things. It was her, the woman from across the hall, standing in his doorway like she belonged there. For a moment, neither of them moved. David just stared, his pen still in his hand, a highlighter hanging from his mouth where he'd been holding it while reading. She stood there looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It wasn't apologetic or embarrassed like you'd expect from someone who just walked into the wrong place. It was something else entirely. "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong," David started to say, but the words died in his throat when he realized she wasn't looking confused or lost. She was looking directly at him. And there was something in her eyes that made his stomach flip in a way he'd never experienced before. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The soft click of the door shutting seemed to echo in the quiet apartment. David's mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't normal. People didn't just walk into other people's apartments. Did they? Maybe this was some kind of emergency. "Are you okay?" he asked, finally finding his voice. "Is something wrong? Do you need help with something?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked further into his living room, her eyes taking in the scattered textbooks, the neat piles of research papers, the carefully organized study space he'd created. She moved with confidence like she'd been in his apartment 100 times before. David watched her, completely confused but somehow not afraid. There was something about her presence that felt safe, even though the whole situation was anything but normal. She had this way of moving that reminded him of dancers he'd seen in movies, graceful and purposeful. "I've been thinking about you," she said finally, her voice softer than he'd expected. It was the first time he'd heard her speak more than a few words, and her voice had a warmth to it that made him feel something he couldn't quite name. "Thinking about me?" David repeated, like he wasn't sure he'd heard her correctly. "But we've never really talked." She smiled at that, a small smile that seemed to hold secrets. "Sometimes you don't need to talk to someone to know things about them," she said. "I've watched you help Mrs. Chen with her groceries every week. I've seen you studying by your window, always so focused and dedicated. I know you're kind because of how gently you speak to people in the hallway." David felt his face getting warm. He hadn't realized anyone was paying attention to the small things he did. He helped Mrs. Chen because it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted recognition. And his studying habits were just that, habits. He never thought anyone would find them interesting. "I don't understand," he said honestly. "Why are you here? I mean, not that you're not welcome, it's just that normal people knock first," she finished for him, and there was a hint of amusement in her voice. "You're right. Normal people do knock first. But I've been trying to work up the courage to knock on your door for weeks, and every time I stand outside in the hallway, I lose my nerve." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. This confident, vibrant woman had been nervous about talking. To him, it didn't make sense. From what little he'd observed about her, she seemed like the type of person who could talk to anyone about anything. "So tonight," she continued, "I decided I was done being nervous. I was done waiting for the perfect moment or the perfect thing to say. I saw your light on and decided to just do something about how I've been feeling." She moved closer to where he was sitting on the couch, and David found himself holding his breath. She was close enough now that he could smell her perfume, something light and flowery that made his head spin a little. He'd never been this close to her before, and he was amazed by little details he'd never noticed. The way her hair caught the light from his desk lamp, the small freckles across her nose, the way her eyes seemed to change color depending on how the light hit them. "How you've been feeling?" David asked, his voice coming out quieter than he intended. Instead of answering with words, she reached out and gently touched his face. Her hand was warm and soft, and David felt like his entire body was suddenly awake in a way it had never been before. She traced her thumb along his cheek, and he found himself leaning into her touch without thinking about it. "I've been feeling," Like I needed to know you better, she said. Like there was something important waiting for us to discover it together. David's logical mind was trying to process everything that was happening, but his heart was beating so fast he could barely think straight. This was like something out of the romance novels his sister used to read, not something that happened to quiet graduate students who spent their evenings studying human behavior. But here she was, standing in his living room, touching his face, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And the strangest part was that it felt natural. Despite how unexpected and unusual the whole situation was, David felt like this was somehow exactly what was supposed to be happening. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, she stepped back slightly, giving David room to breathe. His heart was still racing, and he felt like his whole world had just shifted on its axis. Everything in his apartment looked the same, but somehow everything felt completely different. I should explain, she said, settling down on the edge of his coffee table, careful not to disturb his organized papers. This probably seems crazy to you. David managed a small laugh. Crazy is one word for it, he said. But I'm not complaining. I'm just confused. She looked down at her hands for a moment, and David saw a vulnerability there that surprised him. This confident woman who had just walked into his apartment like she owned the place suddenly looked nervous and uncertain. I broke up with someone 2 weeks ago, she said quietly. Someone I'd been with for almost 2 years. David felt his stomach drop a little. Of course she had been with someone else. Someone like her wouldn't be single. But then he realized she'd said broke up, past tense, and he felt a small spark of hope. I'm sorry, he said, because he didn't know what else to say. Don't be, she replied, looking back up at him. It was the right thing to do, but it made me realize something about myself that I didn't like very much. She stood up and walked over to his window, looking out at the quiet street below. David watched her, wondering what she was thinking, wishing he was better at reading people in real life instead of just in his textbooks. For 2 years I was always the one making the effort, she continued. I was the one who planned our dates, who brought up important conversations, who tried to make things special between us. He was content to just let things happen to him, to wait for life to come to him instead of going after what he wanted. David could hear the frustration in her voice, and he found himself feeling angry at this guy he'd never met. How could someone have her in their life and not appreciate what they had? I realized I was tired of always being the one to take the first step, she said, turning back to face him. But then I also realized that maybe I'd been doing it with the wrong person. Maybe there was someone out there who would appreciate that kind of gesture, who would understand what it meant. And you think I'm that person? David asked, hardly believing the words were coming out of his mouth. She smiled then, a real smile that lit up her entire face. I've been watching you for months, David. Not in a creepy way, she added quickly, seeing his expression. But we live across the hall from each other. It's hard not to notice things. She knew his name. Somehow that simple fact made everything feel more real, more possible. I've noticed how you always hold the elevator for people, even when you're obviously in a hurry. I've seen you pick up mail that fell out of people's mailboxes and make sure it gets back to them. Last month, when Mrs. Chen was sick, you brought her soup every day for a week. David felt his face getting warm again. You saw that? I saw that and a dozen other small kindnesses that you probably don't even think about. And I started wondering what it would be like to be with someone who cared about people the way you do. She moved back toward the couch, but this time she sat down next to him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. I also noticed that you're always alone, she said gently. And I started wondering if maybe you were lonely too. If maybe you were just as tired of waiting for something to happen as I was. David thought about that. Was he lonely? He'd convinced himself that he preferred being alone, that he was happy with his books and his research and his quiet evenings. But sitting here next to her, feeling more alive and awake than he had in months, he realized that maybe he had been lonely. Maybe he'd just gotten so good at being alone that he'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone else's company. I watch you study sometimes, she admitted, and David's eyes widened. Your window faces mine, and sometimes when I'm working on my art late at night, I can see you at your desk. You have this look of complete concentration, like whatever you're reading is the most important thing in the world. I found that incredibly attractive. You found my studying attractive? David asked, genuinely surprised. I found your passion attractive, your dedication, the way you care about learning and understanding things. It's so different from the guys I usually meet who seem to care more about appearing smart than actually being smart. She reached over and picked up one of his research papers, scanning the title. Human Connection and Spontaneous Bonding, she read aloud. Is this what you're working on? David nodded, suddenly seeing the irony in the situation. It's about how people form unexpected connections with each other. How sometimes the most meaningful relationships start with someone taking a risk or doing something spontaneous. She laughed, a sound that was warm and genuine. You're kidding me. I'm not kidding you. I've been reading about this stuff for months, studying how people meet and connect and take chances with each other. And here I am, living it instead of just reading about it. Maybe the universe has a sense of humor, she said. Or maybe you've been preparing for this moment without even knowing it. David looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something click into place inside his chest. This wasn't just attraction or curiosity anymore. This was the beginning of something that felt important, something that felt real. Can I ask you something? He said. Anything. What's your name? I mean, I know we've said hello in the hallway, but I never actually learned your name. She smiled and extended her hand to him like they were meeting for the first time. I'm Lisa, she said. David took her hand, surprised by how perfectly it seemed to fit in his. Nice to meet you, Lisa, he said. I'm David. Nice to meet you too, David. Thanks for letting me crash your study. The formal introduction seemed to break whatever spell had been hanging in the air between them. David felt himself relax for the first time since Lisa had walked through his door. Knowing her name somehow made everything feel more real, more normal, even though nothing about this situation was normal at all. So, Lisa said, settling back against the couch cushions like she planned to stay for a while. Tell me about this research of yours. I mean, really tell me. What made you want to study how people connect? David looked down at the papers scattered around them. He'd talked about his research with professors and fellow students, but never with someone who seemed genuinely curious about it as a person, not just as an academic exercise. I guess I've always been fascinated by the moments that change people's lives, he said. You know how sometimes you can look back and pinpoint exactly when everything shifted? Like before this moment your life was one way, and after it, everything was different? Lisa nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. I think I'm living through one of those moments right now, she said quietly. David felt his heart skip again. Yeah, he said. Me too. He picked up one of his research articles and showed her the title page. This study interviewed people about their most important relationships. The researchers wanted to know how these relationships started, what the first meeting was like, whether people knew right away that this person was going to be important to them. And what did they find? Lisa asked, genuinely interested. That's the amazing part. Almost everyone said their most meaningful relationship started with someone taking a risk, someone deciding to be vulnerable first, to make the first move, to say something they weren't sure they should say. Lisa laughed. Well, I definitely took a risk tonight. The biggest risk I've read about, David said, smiling. Most people in the study just worked up the courage to start a conversation or ask someone out for coffee. You literally walked into a stranger's apartment. Not a stranger, Lisa corrected. I told you I've been paying attention. I probably know more about your daily routine than some people know about their roommates. David thought about that. It should have felt weird, maybe even uncomfortable, but instead it felt kind of wonderful. Someone had been noticing him, really seeing him, when he thought he was invisible to the world. What else do you know about me? He asked. Lisa grinned. You want the full list? I want the full list. She shifted on the couch to face him completely. Okay, but don't get freaked out. You have coffee every morning at exactly 7:30. You always use the same blue mug, and you stand by your Kitchen window while you drink it, looking out at the street like you're planning your day. David nodded. She was absolutely right. You do laundry every Sunday evening and you fold everything immediately instead of letting it sit in the basket like a normal person. You listen to classical music when you study, but jazz when you're cooking. And you talk to yourself when you're working through a difficult problem. I do not talk to myself, David protested, but he was laughing. You absolutely do. I've seen your lips moving when you're really concentrating on something. It's actually pretty cute. David felt his face getting warm again, but in a good way. What else? You always take the stairs instead of the elevator, even when you're carrying heavy bags. You hold doors for people even when they're still pretty far away, which sometimes creates those awkward situations where they have to do that little jog to reach the door. And you have terrible taste in takeout food. Hey, David said, genuinely offended now. I like my takeout food. David, you order the same chicken and rice bowl from the same place 3 times a week. That's not having taste in takeout food, that's having a routine. It's efficient, he said defensively. It's boring, Lisa said, but she was smiling. When's the last time you tried something new? I mean, with food or anything else? David thought about that question longer than he should have needed to. When was the last time he'd tried something new? He couldn't remember. His life had become a series of comfortable routines and predictable choices. I can't remember, he admitted. That's what I thought, and that's part of why I'm here. To criticize my food choices? To shake up your routine, Lisa said. To show you that there's a whole world of experiences you're missing out on because you're too comfortable doing the same things over and over. She stood up and walked over to his kitchen, opening cabinets like she lived there. When's the last time you cooked a real meal? Not heating up leftovers or making toast, but actually cooking something? I cook, David said, following her into the kitchen. Rice and chicken breast don't count as cooking. Lisa opened his refrigerator and peered inside. This is tragic, she announced. You have 3 bottles of water, leftover takeout, and what I think used to be an apple. I don't cook much, David admitted. I'm usually too busy studying to worry about elaborate meals. That's not living, David. That's just surviving. She turned to face him, and he was struck again by how different she was from anyone he'd ever met. Where he was careful and planned, she was spontaneous and bold. Where he stuck to routines, she seemed to embrace change. What do you do for fun? She asked. I read. I study. I go to the library. Those aren't fun, those are work. What do you do when you want to enjoy yourself? David realized he didn't have a good answer for that question either. When had his life become so focused on work and routine that he'd forgotten how to have fun? I don't know, he said honestly. Lisa's expression softened. David, when's the last time you felt truly happy? Not satisfied with an accomplishment or pleased with a good grade, but genuinely, deeply happy? David thought about it, and the answer surprised him. Right now, he said. I feel happy right now. 3 months later, David barely recognized his own life. The same apartment that had once felt like a quiet sanctuary now buzzed with energy and laughter. Lisa had kept her promise to shake up his routine, and the changes had been more dramatic than he could have ever imagined. His kitchen, which had once contained little more than basic necessities, now had actual ingredients. Real spices lined the counter, fresh vegetables filled the refrigerator, and cookbooks occupied space that used to hold only psychology journals. Lisa had taught him to cook, not just heat up food, but actually create meals that tasted like something special. You have to taste everything as you go, she had told him during their second cooking lesson. Cooking is about adjusting and experimenting, not just following instructions exactly. This advice had somehow become a metaphor for how David was learning to live his entire life. Instead of sticking rigidly to his plans and routines, he was learning to adjust and experiment with new experiences. The first major change had been his schedule. Where he used to study alone every evening, he now spent 3 nights a week with Lisa. Sometimes they cooked together, sometimes they went out to restaurants he never would have tried on his own, and sometimes they just talked for hours about everything and nothing. Lisa had introduced him to her world of art and creativity. His apartment now had actual decorations, not just academic posters and bookshelves. She had convinced him to let her hang some of her paintings on his walls, and David was amazed by how much more alive his space felt with her colorful, vibrant artwork brightening the rooms. Art isn't just decoration, she had explained while helping him choose which pieces to display. It's supposed to make you feel something, to remind you that there's beauty in the world beyond textbooks and research papers. She was right. Every morning when David had his coffee, he found himself looking at one of her paintings instead of just staring out the window at the street. The painting showed two people walking toward each other on a bridge, and something about it filled him with hope every time he saw it. But the biggest change was in David himself. The quiet, routine-focused graduate student was still there, but now he was balanced by someone who wasn't afraid to try new things, to take risks, to live more boldly. Lisa had taught him that it was okay to want more from life than just academic success. His research had taken on new depth, too. When he wrote about human connections now, he wasn't just analyzing other people's stories. He had his own story to draw from, his own experience of what it felt like when someone unexpected walked into your life and changed everything. His thesis advisor had noticed the difference in his work. Your recent chapters have a depth and authenticity that wasn't there before, she had told him during their last meeting. It's like you're not just studying these concepts anymore, you're living them. David had to agree. The theoretical knowledge he'd been accumulating for years finally made sense in a practical way. He understood now why people took emotional risks, why they opened themselves up to potential hurt in order to find connection. Because the alternative, living safely but alone, wasn't really living at all. Lisa's influence had extended beyond just their relationship too. David had started reaching out to old friends he'd lost touch with, making more effort to connect with his classmates, and even calling his family more often. She had shown him that relationships required effort and attention, but that the rewards were worth the investment. People aren't like books, she had told him one evening when he was struggling with a difficult conversation with his brother. You can't just read them once and understand everything about them. Relationships are ongoing, they change and grow, and you have to keep paying attention to keep up. The night Lisa had walked into his apartment uninvited seemed like a lifetime ago now, but David could still remember every detail of it. How nervous and confused he had felt, how impossible the whole situation had seemed, how sure he had been that someone like her couldn't really be interested in someone like him. Looking back, he realized that night had been the beginning of not just a relationship, but a completely different way of living. Lisa had shown him that life was meant to be experienced, not just studied. That love was something you did, not something you analyzed. That happiness came from taking chances, not from playing it safe. Their relationship wasn't perfect, of course. They were still very different people with different approaches to life. Lisa sometimes got frustrated with David's need to plan everything, while David occasionally felt overwhelmed by her spontaneity. But they had learned to balance each other, to appreciate their differences instead of fighting against them. The most surprising thing was how natural it all felt now, having Lisa in his life, sharing his space and his thoughts and his dreams with someone else, felt as comfortable as his old routine had once been. Better than comfortable, actually. It felt right. David often thought about the research he had been reading that night about spontaneous connections and life-changing moments. He had become his own case study, living proof that sometimes the most important things in life happen when you least expect them, when you're not even looking for them. As he finished the final draft of his thesis, David included a dedication page that hadn't been there in any of his earlier versions. To Lisa, it read, who taught me that the best research is the kind you live yourself. Sometimes the most profound changes in life come not from careful planning or extensive research, but from someone being brave enough to walk through an unlocked door and change everything. David had learned that the most beautiful connections happen when two people decide to be vulnerable, to take a chance, to trust that something wonderful might be waiting on the other side of fear. And he had learned that sometimes the person you've been looking for your whole life lives just across the hall.